Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and yeah, there's a lot of clutter around me, a lot more stuff around me than there usually is. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to prep a new living space for a population of worms that are presently occupying one of the smaller size containers that I usually run worms in. This is the worm population that I normally refer to as like my mix, my red worm mix. And I started this little bin over here out 112 days ago. That's 16 weeks ago. And at that time I was struggling with a situation where it felt to me like that the environment that those worms were living in previously was sort of crashing and burning, and I had a lot of concern for the worms' well-being. So I attempted to migrate them out of the material that they'd been living in. And then once I felt like I had the majority, if not all of them, collected together already, I went ahead and I relocated them into a fresh home, which is the green tray that they've been living in over here for a while now. And at that time, we collectively, with the estimates I got from you guys, the viewers, as well as the estimate that I came up with, we just averaged all those numbers together, and we came up with an estimated population of only 36 worms living in that container. If you're one of the people that provided a guess or an estimate of how many worms you believe we launched this system off with at that time, then you might have had a number that was higher, you might have had a number that was lower. And what I like to do is I just like to average everyone's estimates together. It's kind of like when you go to one of those, they have those raffles or whatever. It's like, guess how many gumballs are in the machine or whatever like that. They often say that if you take everyone's estimates, once you take the highest estimates and the lowest estimates, they all kind of cancel each other out, and what you're left with is oftentimes a very accurate estimate by averaging all the different estimates of a number of different people's impressions of what's going on there. But, we've been hinting for a while now at the fact that this population has probably bounced back to the point now where they can be relocated into a larger space, and that's what I'm busy doing here now, is basically trying to get a couple of my more shallow trays ready for getting the wormies relocated into a slightly larger container. It's funny, every time at least not every time, but even the last time we checked in on this bin, there was a little spider who kept sort of drawing my attention, and for whatever reason, I don't know if he came out of the green tray or where he came from, but suddenly I've got this little spider that looks just like the same spider we had visiting us last time. So maybe he's already come to the realization that they're being upgraded to a larger new home, and that he might as well just take his space in the new home. Come on, buddy, drop in. So maybe he already figured, hey, I'm gonna jump over there and get dibs on a nice location in here. So, you might have noticed one of the handles on this tray are missing, and not only that, it's one of the trays that I have which is full of holes, as is the one right here. But they're kind of the same size. They're both the more shallow type of tray. Nowadays I've been using the more deep trays. And I figured if I put one inside the other and even put maybe a little liner in between, then I don't have to worry too much about the material in the top tray dropping through and making a mess underneath. And then also I've got the lower tray with both handles intact. So my idea here was, I'll bring you closer to see what I'm doing here. I figured we'd get them relocated, we'd work on it together, and I've got some stuff over here, fresh bedding with which to expand the space, some food items. So I'll bring the camera in closer, I'll put on a glove, and we can get to work. It's so funny, I was looking all over the place for where the little spider had disappeared to, and when I went to grab the container with the bedding supply in it, there he is. This little guy always seems to be one step ahead of me. But I guess I'm going to just grab the spider along with a handful of material. Now I'm assuming the little guy is in here somewhere, but then again, he's a fast mover. He could have avoided me, or evaded me. So I was just roughly trying to estimate how much space the material from the green tray is going to require once it gets dumped into here, and I thought maybe about half. So I figured we would sort of deviate a little bit from the way these little guys were originally introduced into the green tray. In the green tray, I had set up the whole environment, then I plopped them in on top. This time I figured we would plop them in on the side, and then on their own, you know, at their own pace or whatever, they can sort of make their way into the new environment as they see fit to occupy it. And sort of like the last time, I have an unusual ingredient over here, which is the same thing I used when I built up the green tray initially before I launched it and put the worms in. I took one of these dried out sunflowers and included it in the bin. And I don't even know what to consider it as. Food, bedding, it's rather dry. I even tried to like chop off the stem of it enough so that it would lie flat, relatively flat. I just figured we would sort of nest it right here smack in the middle of the new space that we're building out for them. And then, oh, there's our little friend. Our little spider friend. And then just sort of the same way we did last time as well, we had pre-fed the new environment. And that's what we're going to do now. We're just going to bring in some of the materials that I bought for that purpose. I figured this feeding would be the sort of feeding which includes a lot of fine granular materials such as this coffee. And I've also got a slight deviation from my worm chow. It looks a lot like my worm chow, but all this is bird seed. I figured I was just curious, you know, I was curious to see what the bird seed it looks like, because usually when I include the bird seed, it goes into my worm chow alongside a number of other different ingredients. Sometimes some, you know, sometimes it goes in with some whatever, cornstarch or some neem seed meal or some other more powdery type materials. So I was just curious to see what sort of consistency the bird seed alone would have if it got ground up. And luckily it's pretty free flowing the way it is. It's rather dry. Oh, I see the little, I think the little spider got tired of dealing with me, and I just saw the little guy sort of walk across the edge of the table and around the bottom side, so might be lurking around right beneath the table, just waiting for the opportunity to get back in here. So you know, I don't know if that sunflower I put in there would count as food or as bedding, but I do remember the last time I included it, it did seem like the worms were able to break it down quite quickly. So now, besides the shredded paper and cardboard mix, which also includes leaves and moisture, I figured we can also include a little bit of additional leafy material here. I was really interested in seeing if I could build this out a little bit bigger and sort of give them a nice big space into which they can wander. But I'd also like to sprinkle in some of this pulverized bird seed. So I figured between the coffee and the pulverized bird seed, and this was just pulverized eggshell I put in there as grit, I just figured we'd be giving them a pretty comfortable space over there, hopefully, that they can move into gradually. I'm still thinking we can go a little bit more generous on the shredded paper cardboard leaf mixture here. Luckily this stuff has a pretty decent moisture content. I don't have like a fixed recipe for how much moisture I add to my prepared bedding. Sometimes it's a little bit more damp, other times it's not. On this go around it does feel like it's got a pretty decent moisture content to it. And I figured maybe we would try to build this up pretty high, you know? If you know, if we were to just like not come back to this thing for 6 months and we were just going to allow the worms to work all this bedding material down, it would probably end up you know, occupying about half as much space as it occupies now, maybe even less. So the fact that it's almost up to the rim is, to me, it's like not a big deal. In time, I assume it'll just gradually get worked down and collapse down. But I've also been kind of this new thinking that I don't really occupy my bins with quite enough material to maximize the potential of what the worms could be doing. And what they could be doing, especially if they sense that they've got a good amount of space to wander around in, is that they tend to reproduce. So maybe the key to building out my worm population, especially the population like this that needs to rebound from nearly being wiped out, is to give them ample room to, you know, spread out into and feel comfortable in, and hopefully trigger a little bit of mating behavior within them. So, I don't know. I'm always attempting to incorporate various schools of thought into my worm bin maintenance methodologies. So, maybe in this case we're going to see if we can experiment with not only giving them a little bit larger container to live in, but also at the same time significantly building out the possible space for them to be in by making it a nice spacious environment for them. Okay, so this used coffee filter, which was the feeding zone indicator, can just kind of go in here as extra bedding, I believe. And since the feeding zone is really now just the entire side of the bin, I don't even know how do we label that. Maybe we just take one of the coffee filters that I set aside earlier and adopt it as our new feeding zone indicator. I think we'll have no problem figuring out where we last fed next time we come back in here, but it's kind of tradition in my bins to do that. So now I'm thinking if we were to dump this in here, lock, stock, and barrel, we're pretty much done. So, how do we do this without making a huge mess? Times like this, I always feel like I'm gonna create a massive mess. So let's just try to be careful about it. I'm gonna see if I can dislodge some of the material from this far end. You know, this material is really looking nice. Sometimes you sort of open up a bin and it doesn't look quite the way you remember it. It appears as if maybe it suddenly took a leap forward and is now seeming to be far more castings than bedding. I don't know. It's just my perception, maybe. But, you know, after 16 weeks, 112 days, it's not surprising that this population has done a number on the material that they're living in. So now, I guess we can just gradually start pouring it over. This will be an interesting opportunity to give us a glimpse of how many worms we seem to have now. I think for a while now we've been believing that we're well above 36 worms in here. I believe that's fairly certain at this point. Even looks like we've got some leftover bits and pieces of the previous feedings and bedding bits from the last go around from 2 weeks ago. I was wondering if we might see some leftovers from the last feeding 2 weeks ago. Even when we came in here last time 2 weeks ago to give them some pumpkin, I believe it was. I thought I might have seen some leftovers of it. No, we saw leftovers of cherry tomatoes. And I think that's what we're still seeing here, is some skins of tomatoes, which usually do take a little longer. Perhaps the pumpkin they got has been eaten. This material's got a nice dampness level to it. And it might explain a lot of these little white specks. I don't believe that these white specks are the grit that I normally apply to my systems. I believe most of these little white specks are probably springtails. And if we were to do nothing, then just leave this to be for a moment or two, I assume that a lot of these little white specks would vanish down into the bedding, because I believe that they are springtails. Yeah, the majority of them are moving around. But I don't really worry too much about that. Some bin critters, some insects that live alongside your worms in the bins can get a little bit out of control and unwieldy. And then maybe you want to take countermeasures to do away with them, especially flying insects. They don't really belong in a worm bin if you ask me. But stuff like springtails and mites and, I don't know, certain types of worm bin occupants that live alongside the worms are just helpers as far as I'm concerned. And they're welcome to stay. And perhaps the only reason we're seeing a lot of them is because I'm not maintaining things in a way that would otherwise, you know, prevent them from having outbreaks. Maybe if I wasn't maintaining the material so damp, maybe we'd see fewer springtails, but like I said, I don't mind having them in there. So I think we've got all the worms. Just make sure we don't leave any behind. Some of these little ones are hard to spot, you know. And all of this material will dry quite quickly here, leaving this green tray a fairly inhospitable place for any worms that got left behind to be in. I could take a closer look at this momentarily just to make sure we haven't abandoned any of our little wormy friends in the old environment. I can see a cocoon right there. It's pretty dark in color, which suggests that it's probably nearing the point in time when it's going to hatch, releasing its little baby worm occupants. And I usually like to go kind of level when I set up a bin, but here, for this stuff to be a little bit higher than the rest of the bedding in the tray is just fine. Like I said earlier, I believe this stuff is gonna, you know, eventually settle, and then in time we'll be able to level things off a little bit better here than the way we have them now. So we've got our feeding zone indicator, we've got our worms released into their new space. I guess we could restore this sort of top covering piece of paper that was sitting out on the top of the bedding earlier. It's got a few worms hanging out on it, and it's a good material to keep with the worms. And you know, these two pieces of bubble wrap also could just come back at this point, I believe. Maybe I will have to find them a slightly larger top covering just to make sure that the system doesn't start to dry out rapidly. Make sure we protect this thing from drying out and becoming inhospitable, although you know, this casting material over here I believe will hold on to its moisture quite nicely, but I really want the stuff on this other side, this new bedding, to maintain its moisture just as well, so that it becomes, you know, a comfortable place that welcomes the worms and that the worms want to go hang out in. But other than needing to find perhaps another slightly better plastic top covering to protect undue evaporation, I think we're more or less done here. I'll take care of finding something a little bit better to cover up with here. Put this shade covering back on when it's all said and done. And I'll take care of putting everything else away and cleaning up. But I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. I think we're done here. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for keeping me company and for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And, oh, I almost forgot. Before we go, a little bit of, sometimes these labels come off easily, sometimes they don't want to come off. But I figured if we could just reuse the existing label that's got the launch date, then we can use it. If I need to recreate it because I mangled it in my attempt to remove it in a single piece, then I could tend to that as well. So here we go. Let's make sure this is done in an official fashion in compliance with my wormery rules. There we go. It's not the commissioning of a new bin, it's just the upgrade of their space, giving them larger living quarters. I'll leave this out here so I can get them a larger covering on here, but I'm going to let you go. All right, everyone, thanks again for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.